Hey, good evening. This is Tom Feely from Tom's Tall Tales and True Stories. This is going to be episode number 12. And it's March 6th, the day before my third son John's birthday. He celebrates his, I think, 46th birthday tomorrow. So a shout out to my son John. And we would like to welcome you to this program again. This is an unusual episode. I call it The Neighbor from Hell. And there's a particular reason for that, and I'll go into that. Matter of fact, it's going to be a series of stories because these stories I'm about to tell you covers about a 20-year span of our experiences with my next door neighbor. Now, thankfully, we're not talking about my current next door neighbor. They're wonderful people and I love them to death. But this was a neighbor I had for quite a while that created so much havoc in our neighborhood, not just for me, but for many others, that one of the local television stations came out and did like a 3 or 4 part series about him called The Neighbor from Hell. And that's how I chose the title for this particular podcast, The Neighbor from Hell. Now, I really don't want to be sued by anybody, so I'm not going to actually use his real name today. I decided on a pseudonym. So I'm going to call this person Ned F. Hades, such as Neighbor from Hell. And so the story begins when my son Jay came home from school, and he was at the time, I believe, either in 8th or 9th grade. So he's about 13 or 14 years old. We had a neighbor move in next door, and I heard rumors from other neighbors that he, this particular guy we'll call Ned today, was trying to entice my other neighbor's children to go with him into the woods to smoke and to drink beer or whatever. But that was just a rumor, and I didn't know whether to believe it or not. So one day, I came home from work. My son, Jay, was already in the house. He opened the front door, and I'm telling you, he had the most pale, horrified look on his face I've ever seen. It was not normal for him. And I asked him, "What's the matter?" And he pointed to the back patio door. Now, the patio door was a glass sliding door, so I could see through it. And it showed out to our backyard, which at the time there was a wooden privacy fence. On the other side of the fence, I saw a ton of smoke coming up from the other side of my privacy fence. And along with that came higher and higher and higher flames. So there was definitely a fire. I went into, emergency mode and ran out, grabbed the hose, and ran back there. Had to run behind the fence. On the other side of my fence is a forest preserve, which is quite large. And at this time of year, I believe it was in May or June, very, very dry. So he had taken the firewood that I had stacked behind my fence for future use, cords and cords of firewood. And he had poured gasoline onto that cords of fire and lit it on fire. Now, this neighbor hadn't even been in a week, and all of a sudden he set this big fire. My son told me later that he had come home from school and that he heard a knock on the door, and it was this individual, we'll call Ned, and that he asked him if he wanted to smoke any cigarettes? Well, my son is an athlete, so he said, no, thank you. And it was very polite. And he said, well, I've got some beer. Would you like to go out back and drink some beer? If your parents aren't here, we'll have a good time. And this man was at the time probably in his late 30s, early 40s, something like that. So again, my son politely said no and shut the door and locked it, which is exactly what he should have done. So a little bit later, my son looks out the back and sees smoke coming up from behind the fence. And that's about when I came home. And so he was very, very frightened by this experience. Well, I went out and, as I said, and I got a hose and I went back there and I found Ned basically feeding the fire, trying to make it even grow larger. And of course I exploded and set to put out the fire with my hose. He left with no explanation, just disappeared back into his house. And it took me, oh my gosh, 2 hours to put out the fire. It was already spread that hard, and I had a lot of firewood back there stacked up. So it was a massive fire, and it literally burned down the fence that it was stacked up against. But fortunately, that was the extent of the damage, was my fence and the firewood. It didn't spread to my house. It didn't spread to the forest behind us, which would have been a real disaster. So the next day, that same day, the same day, I called the police. Well, at the time, we were in Hillsborough County. We were in the county, not in a city. So I had to call the sheriffs, and they came out, and they sent to us a policeman who happened to be a woman and happened to be black. Well, I knew from his earlier conversations with me that he hated both women and black people, and that he said he was a former or a veteran from the services. And he was quite intoxicated. So this policeman came out in her car. She was alone. And I showed her the back of what happened. And then I took her out to my front yard and showed her what he had done afterwards, which was to take all of the logs that I had doused with water to put out the flames, and he stacked them in my front yard. And I threw some other pieces of junk on top of that. So I had this big smoldering pile of smoking debris, mostly burning logs. And just as we're looking at it, and she's scratching her head and saying, what the heck is this? And as we're looking at it and talking about it, Ned comes around the house with a wheelbarrow full of more smoldering logs. He sees the woman policeman, the sheriff, and he stops dead in his tracks. Now, by now, he's so inebriated, he can hardly walk or talk. So she says, sir, come over here. He puts down the wheelbarrow, and he staggers over very erratically, obviously super intoxicated. And she says to him, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And Ned says, I do this all the time. And just then he says, officer, would you mind if I go throw up? She says, please, don't throw up near me. So he goes back between our two houses and disappears. A few moments later, while we're talking, in my front yard, I notice his garage door go up. And his car backs out. Well, it was a truck, pickup truck. His pickup truck backs out of the garage, and he takes off. Oh my gosh. So I said to the police officer, there he goes. And she gets on a radio and she's calling for help and backup. And pretty soon she takes off and I hear other cars coming from Temple Terrace police and whatever. And they're chasing him. And I can hear through the sirens kind of where they are and where they're going around the neighborhood and all over. And 20, 30 minutes go by and all of a sudden I see him sneak back into his garage and shut the garage door with his truck and goes back in his house. And so I get on the phone, I call them up, I said, the sheriff, he's back. And pretty soon they all came back to his house and parked in front of the house. Well, they knocked on his door, but he wouldn't answer. And they knocked and knocked, and finally they had to wait. And they told me they were waiting to get a warrant to bust into his house and arrest him. Well, it took a while for them to get the warrant, but when they did, they went in the house, and he came out in handcuffs, again, staggering. And then they tried to push him into the patrol car, but he put up all four paws, his 2 feet and his 2 hands. He was fighting, struggling to keep from getting pushed into the car. Didn't want to go, but they managed to get him in. And off he went. So that seemed like that was going to be the end of it for the day. And it was for that day. But the next day I went to work. And I'm sitting in my office. I'm telling a few people about what happened the night before. And somebody said to me, you know, Tom, it's probably right about now that he's going before the judge for arraignment. It's about 9 or 10 in the morning. And I thought about that and I said, what if they release him on bail? Well, and he gets to go home, of course. I thought, oh, great. He'll be going home. My kids will be coming home from school later. God knows what will happen. Who knows? So I went to my boss. Fortunately, I had a very good relationship with my boss. And I said, look, I need the rest of the day off because this is what's going on. And he gave me the day off. I came home. And there he was in my front yard next to this big pile of smoldering logs. And I just about lost my mind because he's back in my yard again. So I got really angry and I told him, look, you take every single log that you put in my yard and you stack it over in your driveway or your yard over there. Well, I was apparently persuasive, let's put it that way. And he did that. He carried everything over to his yard. And when he did, I had gone into my garage and I got out a can of spray paint. It was white, I remember that. And I sprayed a line from the street between our houses all the way back to the woods. Just a white spray painted line. And I told him, if you ever cross that line again, I will kill you. Of course, I didn't mean it, but I wanted to threaten him. I wanted to set my barrier and make sure that he did not ever come to my side of the yard again. I'm protecting my children and my wife. So that was the end of the first incident. There were many, many more, and I could go on. There was nails in the road where I caught him pouring nails in my driveway and in the street. I had several flat tires as a result of that. And it turned out there were other neighbors that were having similar issues with him, some of them very horrific. And I would love to go through all these different stories because it's just incredibly unbelievable. But one of them that really threw me was this one. I was at work. Now I'm at a different school. A number of years have passed. It's not like the next day. It's probably, 5, 10 years later. And I've had multiple interactions with this individual He used to, for instance, put a ladder in his backyard, climb up on the ladder, and take movies or pictures of my wife as she's gardening in the backyard in our yard. Stuff like that. Just things to intimidate her and make her feel uncomfortable, which he accomplished. But then one day I'm at work and the principal's secretary came to me and said to me, "Mr. Feely, I didn't know you were a doctor." I looked at her and I said, "I'm not a doctor. Why?" I said, "I have a master's degree in counseling, but I'm not a doctor." And she said, "Wow, that's weird, because the Temple Terrace Police Department," by the way, now we're under Temple Terrace jurisdiction. We're now in, the house was in the city and the neighborhood was in the city of Temple Terrace. So the Temple Terrace Police Department called and said they needed urgently to speak to Dr. Feely. And I said, I'll be happy to talk to him, but I'll have to tell him that I'm not a doctor. So she brought me to her office. They were on the phone, and it was the police captain of Temple Terrace, and he said, "We have your neighbor, and he's in his house, and he's threatening to commit suicide, and we're afraid he's armed, and we're very, very concerned that he is going to follow through with his threats to commit suicide." He said, "But he will only talk to his best friend," which he says is you, "and also his psychologist, Dr. Feely." I said, "Well, I am not his doctor. I am not a doctor, and I'm not his friend. As a matter of fact, I have been to court against him probably now a half a dozen times." And they said, "Well, we need you to come here right away." So, of course, I got in my car and I drove home. And when I got outside of my neighborhood, it was all blocked off. You couldn't get into my neighborhood. Police cars had cordoned everything off, so nobody could come in and out. So when I drove up, I told the policeman at the guard, I said, "My name is Tom Feely," and they said, "Come right with me." And so they brought me to a command post. They literally had a command post set up in the street outside near our house. And I go in there and the policemen are there, and the captain says to me, he says, "We need you to go in and talk to him and to get him to, present himself to us so we can get him help." And I said, "Why do you want me?" I said, "You got to understand, this man has threatened my life many times, my wife and my children. I've been to court about him. Why would you think I would be the person?" I said, "He wants to kill me." And I said to the police captain, "Why don't you go in there and you talk to him?" And he said, "Because he wants to kill me too." Oh my gosh. So they said, "Well, okay, you're not going to go in. That's fine. We'll have to ask you to leave the neighborhood because, it's blocked off." So we had to leave. We had to go sit in a restaurant for about 6 hours waiting to hear back. And finally, about 11 p.m., we get a call that says, the neighborhood has been cleared. You can come back home to your house. And what I learned then when I came home was that they had finally got the warrants they needed to raid his house, to use smoke bombs, tear gas, and whatnot in order to bring him out and arrest him and take him to, I don't know, mental institution or to jail, whatever. And they discovered that he had, and I'm not sure about the exact number, but the number that sticks in my head is 36 weapons lined up on a big table in his living room. And each weapon had extra ammo specific to that particular type of gun next to it. They were fully loaded and they all had backup ammo. And he was ready to take on every police department from here to Miami. Well, they had, of course, confiscated all of those guns. So he went to jail for a little while, but not for long. And he was released in a matter of a few days. They did not give his guns back, not for a long time. He literally had to appeal to a judge in order to have all of his weapons returned to him. And I think that took a couple years. In the meantime, he was harassing many other neighbors. And I didn't know until this story came out publicly in the news how many neighbors were impacted, how many people that I never even knew about were having these kinds of interactions with this man. So finally, I believe, the thing that finally got him arrested was that he was in a court. The judges were trying to work out a swap agreement of some kind with other states. So they were in discussion with the attorney generals of other states to see if they would take him and they could send somebody to Florida and return and do some kind of a swap. Well, that never worked out because all the attorney generals of other states declined to accept him in a swap agreement. So that didn't work out. And then one day he was then given a short sentence, but in his response to the judge, he threatened the life of the judge. Now, this was in a case where he actually attacked his own significant other with a knife, which brought him before the judge for the 20th time probably. And this time he stepped over the judge's red line by threatening the life of the judge. So the judge gave him a hard time after that, a significantly longer sentence. Again, I don't know where he went after all of that, after his prison sentence, and he was released. But in the meantime, the house turned over a couple of different times until finally our current neighbors bought the house and renovated it and moved in. And we have been very happy with our current neighbors and hope they remain there forever. So this is the story of the neighbor from hell. Now, I want to thank you for listening. I hope you found it a little entertaining. It's a story that took 20 years in the making, and now that he's gone, my life has been so much more pleasant. I now have neighbors on both sides and all around me that are wonderful, wonderful people. So life becomes a lot easier and more enjoyable when that happens. Again, I want to remind you that you're welcome to send me an email at tfeely@me.com. Again, that's tfeely@me.com. Give me a call, leave me a voicemail message if you like. 813-776-6774 is the number. So feel free to give me a call and leave me a message. And again, I want to thank you for following Tom's Tall Tales and True Stories. And now you know the true story. Thank you.